It was July 13th, 1983, and Wembley Stadium was buzzing with an electric energy that could be felt throughout London. The venue was hosting a special live television event called Rock for Relief, a star-studded benefit concert that was being broadcast simultaneously to audiences across Britain, America, and dozens of other countries around the world. The estimated global television audience was 35 million people, making it one of the most watched live music events in television history up to that point. The concept behind Rock for Relief was ambitious: bring together some of the biggest names in rock and pop music for a single evening that would raise money for famine relief in Africa, while showcasing the power of music to unite people across cultural and geographical boundaries. The organizers had assembled an incredible lineup that included everyone from David Bowie and Queen to The Who and solo artists like Eric Clapton. Eric had been looking forward to the event for months, seeing it as an opportunity to contribute to an important cause while performing alongside musicians he had known and respected for decades. At 38, Eric was at a fascinating point in his career. He had achieved massive commercial success with his recent albums, but he was also dealing with the complex relationship between artistic authenticity and mainstream popularity that every successful musician eventually faces. The television special was being produced with unprecedented ambition and complexity. Multiple camera crews were positioned throughout Wembley Stadium, and the broadcast included not just the live performances, but also behind-the-scenes segments, artist interviews, and backstage interactions that were meant to give viewers an intimate look at how such a massive production came together. One of the most anticipated segments was a round-table discussion featuring several of the headlining artists, including Eric Clapton, Pete Townshend from The Who, David Bowie, and Sting. The discussion was meant to be a thoughtful conversation about music, social responsibility, and the role that artists could play in addressing global issues. Pete Townshend, at 38, was dealing with his own complex feelings about fame, commercial success, and artistic integrity. The Who had been one of the most important and influential rock bands of the 1960s and 1970s, but Pete had watched as some of his contemporaries, in his view, had compromised their artistic vision in pursuit of mainstream success and radio-friendly material. In the weeks leading up to Rock for Relief, Pete had been giving interviews where he expressed increasingly pointed criticism of what he saw as the commercialization of rock music. He had made several comments about musicians who had sold out their original artistic vision, though he had not named specific individuals. The backstage area at Wembley was a maze of trailers, equipment trucks, and temporary structures that had been erected to accommodate the dozens of performers, crew members, and television production staff. Eric was in his assigned trailer, preparing for both his live performance and the televised discussion, when he heard raised voices coming from the direction of Pete Townshend's trailer. Eric had known Pete for over 15 years, and while they had never been particularly close friends, they had always maintained a respectful professional relationship based on their mutual admiration for each other's musical abilities. Both men had emerged from the British blues and rock scene of the 1960s and 1970s, and both had achieved significant success while maintaining their reputations as serious musicians rather than mere entertainers.
But Eric had been hearing through the music industry grapevine that Pete had been making increasingly critical comments about musicians who had achieved mainstream success, and Eric suspected that some of those comments might be directed at him. Eric's recent albums had indeed been more commercially oriented than his earlier work, and he had achieved significant radio play and album sales that some critics and fellow musicians viewed as evidence of artistic compromise. About an hour before the televised discussion was scheduled to begin, Eric decided to address the situation directly. He walked over to Pete's trailer and knocked on the door. "Pete, it's Eric. Do you have a minute to talk?" Pete opened the door, and Eric could immediately see that the Who guitarist was in an agitated mood. Pete's eyes were intense, and his body language suggested that he had been building up to some kind of confrontation. "Eric," Pete said, "actually, I'm glad you're here. I think we need to clear the air about some things." "That's exactly why I'm here," Eric replied. "I've been hearing that you have some issues with the direction my music has taken recently." Pete stepped aside to let Eric into the trailer, and what followed was a conversation that would set the stage for one of the most dramatic moments in live television history. "It's not personal, Eric," Pete began, "but I think we need to be honest about what's happening to rock music. We started this movement to say something important, to challenge people, to push boundaries, but too many of us have gotten comfortable, gotten rich, and lost sight of what we were trying to accomplish." Eric listened carefully, recognizing that Pete's frustration was genuine, even if he disagreed with the implications. "Pete, I understand your concerns, but I don't think commercial success necessarily means artistic compromise. I'm still the same musician I've always been. I'm still playing from the heart, still trying to connect with people through music." "Are you?" Pete asked sharply, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've traded your blues soul for radio play. It looks like you've decided that being popular is more important than being authentic." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with both men becoming increasingly heated in their exchanges. Eric defended his recent musical choices, while Pete argued that Eric had abandoned the artistic principles that had made him a great musician in the first place. What neither man realized was that their conversation was taking place just 30 minutes before they were both scheduled to appear in the live televised discussion, and the tension between them was about to explode in front of 35 million viewers. The roundtable discussion was set up on a small stage area within Wembley Stadium, with cameras positioned to capture both the individual participants and the group dynamic. The format was meant to be casual and conversational, with the host asking open-ended questions about music, social issues, and the artists' perspectives on their responsibilities as public figures. Eric and Pete took their seats along with David Bowie and Sting, both men still carrying the emotional charge from their backstage confrontation. The television audience had no idea that two of the participants were barely containing their anger toward each other. The discussion began innocuously enough, with questions about the importance of benefit concerts and the role that music could play in raising awareness about global issues. But about 15 minutes into the segment, the host asked a question that would trigger the most dramatic moment in live music television history. "There's been a lot of discussion recently about the relationship between commercial success and artistic integrity in rock music," the host said. "How do you balance the desire to reach a wide audience with the need to stay true to your artistic vision?" Pete Townshend's response was immediate and pointed. "Well, I think that's exactly the problem," Pete said, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone on the set take notice. "Too many musicians have stopped asking that question. They've decided that reaching a wide audience is more important than having something meaningful to say." Eric felt his pulse quicken, sensing that Pete was building toward something. "Some artists," Pete continued, looking directly at Eric, "have completely abandoned what made them special in the first place. They've traded their authenticity for radio-friendly material that doesn't challenge anyone or say anything important." The host and the other participants sensed the tension building, but before anyone could redirect the conversation, Pete made it explicit. "I'm talking about musicians like Eric here," Pete said, gesturing toward Eric with unmistakable accusation in his voice. "Eric used to be one of the most authentic blues guitarists of our generation, but look at his recent work. It's slick, it's commercial, it's designed to sell records rather than move souls. He's become exactly what we used to stand against." The television cameras captured Eric's reaction, a mixture of shock, hurt, and rising anger. 35 million viewers around the world watched as one of rock music's most respected guitarists was publicly accused of selling out by one of his peers. Eric's first instinct was to respond with words to defend himself verbally against Pete's accusations. But as he sat there, feeling the weight of 35 million people watching him, Eric made a decision that would become one of the most talked-about moments in television history. Instead of engaging in a verbal argument, Eric quietly stood up from his chair and walked over to where a guitar was positioned for the musical segments of the show. Without saying a word, he picked up the instrument and plugged it into a nearby amplifier. The host, the other participants, and the television production crew were unsure how to respond. This wasn't part of the planned program, but Eric's actions were so deliberate and purposeful that everyone instinctively understood that something significant was about to happen. Eric adjusted the amplifier settings, tested the guitar's tuning, and then looked directly at Pete Townshend, who was watching with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What happened next was 5 minutes of the most intense, emotional, and technically brilliant blues guitar playing that had ever been broadcast on live television. Eric began with a slow, haunting melody that immediately established the emotional depth and authenticity that Pete had accused him of abandoning. His fingers found notes that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique or training. They came from a place of genuine feeling that no amount of commercial success could diminish.
As Eric's solo developed, it became clear that this wasn't just a guitar performance. It was a musical argument, a defense of his artistic integrity that was more powerful than any words could have been. Every note, every bend, every moment of silence spoke to his connection to the blues tradition that had shaped him as a musician. The camera operators, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, adjusted their shots to capture not just Eric's performance, but also the reactions of everyone around him. Pete Townshend's expression gradually changed from skeptical challenge to recognition to something approaching awe. Eric's guitar solo moved through different emotional territories: pain, defiance, vulnerability, and ultimately a kind of transcendent beauty that reminded everyone listening why he had become one of the most respected musicians of his generation. This wasn't commercial music designed to sell records. This was art in its purest form, created in the moment and shared with authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. As Eric played, something remarkable happened throughout the stadium and in television audiences around the world. People stopped what they were doing and simply listened. The usual background noise of a large venue production faded away as everyone present became absorbed in the music. When Eric finally brought his solo to a close, the silence that followed was profound. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. The television cameras captured a moment of collective recognition that something special had just occurred. Pete Townshend was the first to break the silence. He stood up from his chair and walked over to Eric, and in front of 35 million viewers, he offered his hand. "Eric," Pete said, his voice carrying clearly through the stadium's sound system, "I was wrong. That was everything I remember about why I fell in love with rock music in the first place. I apologize for questioning your authenticity. That performance just proved that you haven't lost anything. If anything, you've grown as an artist." Eric accepted Pete's handshake and embraced him, and the television audience witnessed a moment of genuine reconciliation and mutual respect. "We're all trying to find our way through this business," Eric said into his microphone, addressing both Pete and the global audience. "Success doesn't have to mean compromise, and commercial appeal doesn't have to mean abandoning your artistic soul. Music is big enough for all of us to find our own path." The remainder of the televised discussion took on a completely different tone, with all the participants engaging in a more thoughtful and nuanced conversation about the challenges and responsibilities that come with being successful musicians. But it was Eric's guitar solo that became the defining moment of Rock for Relief and one of the most replayed segments in music television history.
In the days following the broadcast, music critics, fans, and fellow musicians hailed it as a perfect example of how true artistry transcends commercial categories. The incident also marked a turning point in Eric's career and public perception. Rather than being defensive about his commercial success, Eric had demonstrated that artistic authenticity and popular appeal could coexist. His response to Pete's challenge had been both dignified and powerful, showing that the most effective way to answer criticism wasn't through argument, but through art itself.
In the immediate aftermath of the broadcast, phone lines at television stations and music magazines were flooded with calls from viewers who had been moved by Eric's performance. Many described it as one of the most powerful musical moments they had ever witnessed on television. The performance was replayed countless times in the weeks following the broadcast, and bootleg recordings began circulating among music fans who wanted to experience it repeatedly. Music critics were unanimous in their praise for both the performance and the way Eric had handled the confrontation. Rolling Stone magazine called it a masterclass in artistic dignity, while the Times of London described it as 5 minutes that redefined what it means to be an authentic musician in the modern era. The performance also had a profound impact on other musicians who had been watching. Many artists who had faced similar criticisms about selling out began to see Eric's response as a new model for how to address such concerns. Rather than becoming defensive or engaging in public arguments about artistic integrity, musicians could simply let their music speak for itself. Pete Townshend, for his part, underwent a significant period of reflection following the incident. He publicly acknowledged that his criticism of Eric had been unfair and based on assumptions rather than careful consideration of Eric's actual musical output. In a lengthy interview with Musician magazine 2 months after the broadcast, Pete discussed how the experience had taught him about the dangers of judging fellow artists too quickly. "What I learned that night," Pete said in the interview, "is that artistic integrity isn't about rejecting commercial success. It's about maintaining your connection to the music and to the reasons you started playing in the first place." Eric proved that night that he hadn't lost that connection, regardless of how many records he'd sold. The incident also sparked broader conversations within the music industry about the relationship between artistic authenticity and commercial viability. Record executives, managers, and musicians began to discuss more openly how artists could maintain their creative vision while still reaching wide audiences. Several music schools and universities began using footage of Eric's Wembley response in their courses on music performance and industry studies. The incident became a case study in crisis management, artistic communication, and the power of music to transcend verbal arguments. The 5-minute guitar solo became known as the Wembley response, and it was studied by music students, analyzed by critics, and celebrated by fans as an example of music's power to communicate more effectively than words. It also became a template for how artists could respond to criticism with grace and authenticity rather than defensiveness or anger. Years later, when music journalists asked Eric about the most important performances of his career, he would often mention the Wembley solo, not because of its technical complexity, but because of its emotional honesty and the circumstances under which it was performed. "That wasn't a planned performance," Eric would say in interviews. "That was just me responding to a challenge the only way I knew how, through music." Sometimes the most authentic moments happen when you stop thinking about being authentic and just play from the heart. The incident became legendary, not just because 35 million people witnessed it live, but because it captured something essential about the relationship between artistic integrity and public success. It proved that true artists don't need to defend themselves with words. Their art speaks for itself. Sometimes the most powerful response to criticism isn't an argument, but a demonstration of the very qualities that are being questioned.